Hello, friends. Welcome to the C3 podcast. I'm your host and co-creator, Myron Isaiah Bryant. Thank you for taking the time to listen and being a part of our community. At its core, C3 exists to create a safe space for us all to be humans first, learn from each other's professional and life experiences, and choose to co-create a healthy community of betterment. I'm excited for today's conversation with our guest. And with that, let's dive into the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the C3 podcast with Myron and Brian. I'm super excited today to connect with one of my friends, Davidson, as he talks about his professional journey, things he's learned through sales, to starting his own organization, and the humanity he brings to this journey and to those around him as he impacts individuals at scale. Without further ado, Davidson, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Yeah, you never know who you're going to meet. That's why I love the communities I'm part of. And
Yeah.
I'm just, honestly, I'm really proud of you. Like, not only does it take courage to put yourself out there and be consistent with the podcast, but everything in the process has been really intentional. You're very thoughtful in all of your approach. So I can imagine as a leader, you're probably very good at being detail oriented and just thorough and very thoughtful in your approach as a leader. So it's been great to be a part of this so far.
Thank you, dude. Many of it I've learned from you, right? I mean, you have your own podcast and your own platforms as well there. And I know you and we first met in Ian's sales coaching program, and another just very intentional, very amazing leader that's impacting people at scale there. So birds of a feather flock together one. And then a lot of what we talk about in this podcast is community and learning from each other. And I've learned a ton from you, man.
No, yeah, likewise. Yeah, I mean, already I've learned a lot from you. So thank you for modeling that.
Well, I appreciate you joining in here for today. As usual, it's a very human first, community and conversation we're building here. So the first question we like to always ask is, who is Davidson as a person, right?
Yeah. I would say I'm like a sensitive, like very emotional guy, person of color. So
Yep.
I'm very vulnerable, or try to be very vulnerable and authentic in just how I'm showing up.
Yep.
And, I would say it took me a long time to come to terms with it because I do think, especially in sales culture, right? Sometimes it is very like macho and it's like, oh, let me chug beers and let's see who can, chug the most, it's like there's still some of that. I would say it's better in tech, I would say, right? Or at least it seems like it's trending in the right direction.
Yeah.
So, I would say I'm a healer. I'm a lover. I'm a husband. I'm a human, so I make mistakes, but I like to, hopefully I like to show that it's okay to be messy and it's okay to ask for help, and we're all just trying to figure it out together.
Yeah. No, and I really appreciate that you started off by talking about, sensitive, human, healer, lover. Like those are things that, one, don't get often associated with sales, right? But I think even for us, right, to men of color, right, like that's even more so on us, right? So
Yeah.
to kind of have that space where we can create that in ourselves and for each other, and begin to, as we've talked about much in these podcast episodes, actualize for ourselves and actualize for those around us. Like it's so important that we have these spaces and be able to communicate in that way.
Yeah, and actually I hear in Black culture it's even harder, right? Because one of my best friends, Edwin Armister, he was an enterprise RM at LinkedIn, so we used to work together. We wrote the book Redefining Masculinity together, so that was like a big topic for us to just, and he spoke very candidly about that, the macho, like, I mean, a lot of people of color, right? It is like still very macho, but I get it, right? Because, when you're in survival all the time, it's kind of like, there's a lot of layers to it. But, so yeah, I think similar with Vietnamese culture, because a lot of my friends that are Vietnamese, like never had a father around. And I also didn't have a father growing up most of my life. So, naturally you kind of have to like step up as the man of the house. So you can't really show weakness, and you kind of have to become an adult at a much earlier stage than most people. So it's been interesting.
No, it's so important because, like you said, it's understanding and having some sympathy, maybe empathy for those previous cultures of what they've gone through and how hard it was
Yeah.
for them to
Mm.
be sensitive or communicate and empathetic, but also
Yeah.
creating a way for ourselves and for future generations to be to communicate better, frankly.
Hmm.
Right. So it's so
Yeah.
important there.
Yeah. I love what you said, like having the empathy that it was different. Like they did encounter a lot more
Yeah.
circumstances, a lot more obstacles than we have the privilege of, right? Just being a little bit, a world that's a bit more progressive now, and a little bit more
Yeah.
understanding, right? For the
Yeah.
most part, like collectively, I would say.
No, I'm excited that we're able to have these conversations, right? As I keep coming back to, and a lot of what we're creating through this episode, through this podcast, or just our friendship is a space to be to talk about those things, right? And do that in a healthy way. Um, you talked about just the way you experience life yourself there and the way you describe yourself. But let's talk about your path and then talk about your values from there. You've done some really interesting and super cool things, right? So in this macho world, you've checked many of those boxes that people are like, oh, like he's done an amazing in sales and he's done these different things.
Oh,
And I call it out to say, right, you've done that with intentionality. You've done that with being empathetic and caring around you. So take us through what that path has been for you, high level, and then we'll kind of dive in a little bit.
yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I've been in sales my whole life, and like yourself, like sales is just amazing because you do get to meet so many cool people, right?
Yeah,
So I was an SDR for a while, so I was really good at being an SDR. But I honestly, because I was so good at being SDR, I was afraid. It's like, oh, if I get to the next stage, like, am I going to be as successful? And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, like, it was a struggle. Like, there were a couple of roles where it wasn't a good fit, and I would say I failed as an AE where I didn't do well, and that really messed with my confidence. But I was
yeah,
very fortunate. I met a mentor who ended up being my manager at TriNet, and that was like the first position that I was like I did really well and I crushed it, and
yeah,
that really gave me the confidence. And he would always plant these like seeds in me and said like, man, like if I had an ounce of your talent, like I wouldn't waste it. And he just kept saying it until I believed it into myself, and then that was what really. And then I did a lot of self development, a lot of coaching, and hired a lot of coaches like Ian, where I met you, and every coach unlocked like a new level of confidence. And then I would still say I'm not gonna lie, like I do suffer from imposter syndrome sometimes, right? Especially, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've been interviewed on 32 podcasts in the last 90 days, so it's like after, of course, there's a bit of imposter syndrome when you're kind of putting yourself out there that much.
yeah,
And then I became at LinkedIn. I also had pretty decent success, and I got into similar as very competitive, similar to Salesforce. I'm sure where you're
yeah,
surrounded by all of these ambitious people, and I was winning a lot of the spiffs, and I was super involved with like all the LinkedIn ERG stuff. For people who don't know, that's just like the employee resource groups. A lot of the minority groups, like we would partner with the Black Inclusion Group and the Hispanics of LinkedIn and all the different diversity groups. And that's when I really found myself as a leader, because I would be partnering with all these different, like Amazon, Google, Salesforce, all these different ERGs, and I was the catalyst, and I was able to help build out the Society of Asians in Sales and Customer Success to 1,000 people, and I was like one of the co-founders there. So that helped me build my confidence. And yeah, now I'm talking a lot. Any questions, or should I just keep going?
just keep going.
Okay. Okay. And then, so I was an S&B AE at LinkedIn, and then I left to go to mid market at a company called Coach Hub, where I was employee number 6 in the US, and then I helped them grow to like 150 in the US. So I was able to recruit like 12 of my friends to come work at Coach Hub, and that was like such a cool experience to be able to build a lot of these learning and development organizations and help ERG groups in a lot of these mid-market organizations, like companies that were around 500 to 5,000 employees. So that was really meaningful, and that kind of planted the seed. I'm like, oh, maybe I should become a coach, because I just got so much value from my coach that Coach Hub gave me. And then I became an enterprise AE at Udemy, which is training. So I was helping a lot of companies like train. So Udemy is more known for like a lot of like the cloud migrations. So I was helping a lot of companies with their AWS and Azure and a lot of these cloud migrations. But ultimately, I realized like making more money didn't make me as happy as like doing meaningful work. So then I went to Fortune. So most people know Fortune for like the Fortune magazine, which is like the Fortune 1,100 rankings. So I helped build Fortune's first mentorship program in their 100 years of being a company. So rolling that out was extremely rewarding, and we were able to pair up like 56 people, and that was like a really cool experience. But so I was actually affected by layoffs. Like we did mass layoffs, so that kind of messed with my confidence a little bit. But then, and then I went back to TriNet, which was one of the companies I worked at where I had my mentor. And then after that, I was like, you know what? Like, instead of waiting 5 years later, which was my original goal to become a life coach, like, let me just launch this Daring Hearts. And my goal is to impact 100 million lives. So that's through content, through just who I'm being and just putting myself out there. And it's been a wild ride.
No, I love that, man. I mean, you started out, like you said, describing yourself as in sales your whole life, and then you described your intentionality behind that, which again, we keep coming back to within this platform is being intentional about being in sales. It's not a manipulative culture. It's not a macho, as we used earlier, culture, which is associated with it. The best salespeople are just human and incredibly intentional and compassionate and honest, right? And along that, you had some really cool, accomplishments, right? You talked about launching a few different things from ERG groups to mentorship programs there, and then through that, finding and actualizing yourself that, hey, just as well as I can do in a sales role for clothing and getting the big sales deal, I enjoy mentoring and giving back to others, and that's just an amazing story, man. It really mirrors a lot of what I've experienced in my career. When you talk about mentors, right? Some of my best mentors have been on this podcast. Some of them are going to be in future episodes there. How important was that to you, right? Because you said something that I really resonate with is that they told you what they saw in you that could be successful. Well, I wish I had that talent, things like that. And I don't think I would have been anywhere near to where I am today if people hadn't pulled me aside and really spoke those things into me and helped me development. How important has that mentorship been for you there?
That's a good question. I do think it's important. I think there's two ways to approach mentorship. I think like everyone should be proactive in reaching out to mentors that whatever resonates with them. So like I would, being a person that's Asian, like I would reach out to a lot of Asian CROs or VPs, and it's funny because I remember Paul Park, he ended up being like the interim CRO at TriNet, multi-billion-dollar company. I reached out to him like the first day at TriNet, and I was like, "Hey, Paul, like, just want to I just want to introduce myself. Like, I admire your training. Like, the way you build ecosystems and the framework that you provided was so eye-opening. Like, I would love to meet you one day." And then like every time he flew into New York, he would take us out to Korean barbecue, right? And even today, he still mentors me. So I would say, be super proactive and then just find any commonality, right? Whether it's like someone who looks like you or just comes from the same background or any common themes. And then I think the other mentors are people you don't even necessarily have to meet with a lot, but like just you can model their behaviors, right? So there's a lot of podcasts that I listen to, like Scott Ingram, who runs like the Sales Success Summit and the Sales Success podcast, was like one of the first podcasters I listened to. And I never met him, but I didn't meet him until I went to the conference. But as soon as I listened to his podcast, I would message him and be like, "Hey, these are like my top 5 favorite episodes. Like this is, what I got from it." And he was like blown away. He's like, "Oh man, this guy's like really like proactive." And then the other day I got to be on his podcast, which was like such a cool, like full circle moment, because he was like the guy who inspired me. But yeah, and to your point, like mentorship is important. I think if I was to, I would say half of it has been toward like mentorship has been very helpful, and then the other half has been like a combination of therapy. Well, okay, I would say 1/3 therapy, 1/3 coaching, and 1/3 mentorship. If I was to quantify like how impactful they were in terms of my growth.
No, I love you mentioned therapy on that. We talk about that a lot on this podcast. Is again just being human and doing what we do on a professional journey, but finding healthy ways to do that. And we'll probably talk a little bit about the therapy part in here in a bit. But I love that you mentioned in terms of the mentorship, like you were proactive in reaching out and starting that relationship and maintaining that. And I talk with a lot of people, and I remember even myself when I first started my professional career, like, hey, like getting to networking, getting a mentor seems so ambiguous, and to some way, just like the word sales, like it was almost this bad perception of like, oh, we're going to a networking event. And even to this day, I'll be honest, if you name your event networking event, like Myron is not excited to show up. Just to be honest. But
Yeah.
if you talk about connect, if you talk about building community, if you talk about those things with intentionality, it's amazing. So how do you kind of think about that mentoring, that networking, that
Mm.
action you talked about where you identified someone you can learn from and you were excited to reach out and communicate that? How do
Mm.
you kind of process it and talk about that?
I love how your theme is all about being human, right? I
Yeah.
think sometimes we put people on a pedestal. I'm not gonna lie, like when I first met Ian, I was intimidated because he has a presence, right?
Yes.
He's very like in your
Yeah.
face.
Yeah.
So I was afraid to approach him, you know?
Yeah.
But then I sat right next to him and he was just like a normal dude. And I keep forgetting that these like people that we idolize, like people that we look up to them, right? Like, and I'll never forget, like, we took a selfie together and then I had Ian on my podcast and like now I feel like he's like I really feel like he's like my brother, like
Yeah.
I just like the stuff that we talk about,
Yeah.
like my insecurities with like marriage and just like everything. Like he knows
Yeah.
more about me than most of my family does, right? So
Yeah.
I think the key is like just to be honest and be upfront about your insecurities and not try to put up like, oh, everything's okay. Like just be honest with him. So like even last week on Friday, I shared with him that I was like struggling financially and he did something that was like so kind that I'll never forget,
Yeah.
so it's just like one of those things that I think just be as honest as possible, even especially with your mentors, right? Because they can see through like the
Yep.
BS, like I think we try to like put up a front, but they're like, all right, Davidson, what's going on? Like, tell me what's up.
No, I love the ping for, as you mentioned, honesty, authenticity, vulnerability there. And the beautiful thing about it is that now if you compare that to kind of where you're at within leadership, and I think we're both at in leadership, is that those things are so needed. When I was in the process of moving to a leadership role, I remember one of the leaders I reached out to said, a lot of leadership, both for people hiring you and people around you, is people being able to trust that you are who you say you are. And it's
Mm,
such a simple thing, but exactly what you just mentioned, right, is like people have to know that you're human. They have to know that you have insecurities, that you have strengths, and that you own that and are willing to
mm,
move forward and get better together from that. People don't always resonate or want to follow someone who seems completely
mm.
untouchable or inhuman,
Yeah,
because that
yeah,
seems just weird, right? It just seems a little bit weird.
yeah, it really is. It's just not as relatable. And
Yeah.
and those people do have insecurities and stuff like that, right? They're just not showing their shadow, right? So
Yeah.
it's just like a defense mechanism. But I get it,
Yeah.
right? Like we all at
Yeah.
one point go through those stages where we also were
Absolutely.
trying to put up like this guard or trying to protect ourselves. So I mean, I've been
Yeah.
guilty of it myself.
Likewise. Likewise. Now, you mentioned a really interesting path there. And I think towards the end, you may have mentioned you started your own organization there as well and now leading that. What have been your key values along the professional path you've been on that have allowed you to be successful and allowed you to be authentic along the way there?
Huh. Key values. I would say, well, one would be like I'm always like thinking about other people, so I'm always like
Yeah.
connecting people together. So I always ask when I have coffee with people, like, hey, who are you looking to meet, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
like a fractional COO or fractional CFO. So because I'm always like connecting people together, and then I host a lot of like monthly networking events. So when
Yeah.
people hang out and they become friends, and then they'll always ping me. They're like, oh, like we met at your networking event and now we're biffles and we go on vacation together and all this stuff. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is so cool. So I always get a lot of value from like being like a matchmaker, like not only like romantically, but just like business partner wise, or in general, like if someone's looking for a chiropractor, it's like, hey, Dr. Anna, and I always, I'll always write like a really thoughtful introduction. It's like, hey, Dr. Anna is like the #1 rated doctor in ZocDoc in New York City. That's how I found her as a chiropractor, right? And then like, because you're framing it that way, like everyone loves it. So that's like a shortcut way of building, really strong relationships. So I'd say relationships, #1, being like thoughtful, right? So just making really good introductions, like going above and beyond, like even just sending people like singing happy birthday on their birthday as a voicemail. Like people love that. Like people are like, oh, like that's so cute. And it's memorable. It's different, handwritten cards like have helped a lot. I think I've written probably like 600 handwritten cards in my lifetime. So, all of my clients, all of my channel partners, like people I've closed deals with, right? And then like #5, like just be like I would say like overshare. Like I know that's like a weird thing, like that could be like polarizing, but what I mean by that is just like you just never know what other people are going through. So sometimes you have to be like the first one to like just be like, hey, like, honestly, like I'm really struggling, or like I'm struggling, like me and my wife aren't on the same page, like, and then just because you started with that, like that gives permission for other people to just be honest about what's going on in their lives. And that's good, because then every time I start off with that, then like the conversations inherently get like deeper, and it's not just surface level, like, hey, what's the weather like,
Well, Davidson, I would 100% go to one of your networking events. And be excited to go to because of the values you mentioned. Like relationships, intentionality, and then just having that ability to, I think you mentioned overshare, but I'll call it vulnerability, right? It's like that authentic vulnerability. It's like, that is such a big thing for people, is like having that permission to be themselves, right? And there's many ways you can tell people you have that permission to be yourself, but I think modeling that is the best way to tell someone that, because if you say the words, not every time everyone believe you, but if you model that, you're like, wait a second, he's doing it, I can do it too. So in terms of just how those values have shown up throughout your journey, you've done some interesting things, from sales to tech, just starting your own organization, doing a lot of things within community. How do you integrate those values into the journey you've had so far?
This is a tough one, right? Because I do think, like with anything in life, there should be alignment, right? So I think in the beginning, like I would just say yes to everything, and naturally, like you end up burning out. But I think like as we get older, like we just are just a lot more intentional about everything, right? So, I think for me, like it showed up with like a lot of my side projects, like the books I've written, the podcast, the YouTube channel, right? So a lot of, naturally, if I'm just showing up and I'm just like, oh, okay, this is just like an expression of who I am, then it's just a lot easier. But I'm not gonna lie, like in the beginning, like it was hard for me to find out what these values are, because some of it was societal, right? Like some of it's like, okay, well, society, like I'm in New York City right now, right? So it's like in New York City, it's like, okay, we all value money, we all value like, so it's just like the hustle culture, right? So it's like, okay, like do I actually care about money and hustle culture? It's like, well, maybe it's like a 6.5 out of 10, like if I actually was to be honest with myself. So that takes like a lot of introspection. That takes a lot of vulnerability, right? Like just to be like, hey, like I'm just gonna be real with you. Like this is not the most important thing to me, And then, so that's how I've been able to integrate it, just to be like really asked, like, what's the why? So if, let's say, my goal is to become a President's Club winner, it's like, okay, well, what about, like, why, right? Is it because I like being on stage and everyone's clapping for me? It's like, well, what is that about? It's like, and then like once you kind of ask like why 10 times, you're like, oh, it's because like I got held back in 3rd grade, so I'm trying to overcompensate, and that's why I'm burning out. And then I'm like, so would I be okay with just making, like, let's say I'm okay with just making 275, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's fine. Like I don't have to like,
Yeah.
so I think it's just like being really introspective and just being very intentional about like why I'm doing everything. And that took me a while to figure out because, some of it is cultural, right? So it's like, because I'm Asian, so it's like, all right, am I comparing myself to all my other Asian friends who are very, very successful? And it's like, okay, well, what is that about? And then I realized, like, I hate to generalize like this, but a lot of my on the Enneagram, like a lot of my Asian
Yeah.
friends, I send them the test, and like almost all of them get like achiever as their type, and I'm like, how is this possible? Like I sent this to like 30 people, like what's the probability that all my Asian friends are all achievers, right? But I'm like, oh, okay, because at a societal, like, their parents, and so that's like, okay, well, are they actually achievers? And then once we kind of peel back the layers, like the like I see like dissonance, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's why they're upset, or that's why they're not as happy, because they're doing it for someone else, right? Like their parents, or yeah. So it's a long way of saying, it's taken me a while, but now I try to integrate it to like every project that I'm a part of.
Dude, we're probably going to have another episode just on the cultural. I'm so serious, dude, because
Uh-huh.
everything you're saying, I definitely have experience there. So,
Hmm.
so my partner, her name Renee, she's of Asian descent as well there. So a lot of the things that you're
Ah.
talking about, I can
Hmm.
vicariously understand through her. And
Yeah.
we share a lot of things at the African American community, or even my mother, she's Caribbean there. There's
Oh,
different layers
I
within
heard.
all these
Yeah.
communities.
Yeah. I heard Caribbeans
Not so
hustle.
much.
Yeah.
Hey, dude, that the joke is that Jamaicans can never just have one job.
Yeah.
So you see all these different things, dude, and it's like,
Yeah.
how do you digest that? And particularly the Enneagram thing, I think is interesting because I connect that not just to what you mentioned with Asians culturally there, but it's like even in sales, right? I think a lot of people, and this goes directly to what you talk about, maybe the imposter syndrome. A lot of people know what is expected of them, right? Hey, if you're in sales, you look like this. If you're from this culture, you look like this. If you look like have a certain look, you perform like this. Whatever it is, right? So people have these ideas about the perception of them based off of their characteristics or culture or background and what people
Hmm.
expect from that. And they try to kind of assimilate into that.
Hmm.
And, it rarely works out. Not to say that you can't be what the expectation is, but I don't find that always self-actualizing. I don't find that as always
Hmm.
what makes people fulfilled there. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I identify with that so heavily of the enneagrams because I see it in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, it's funny. I know a lot of Caribbean people too, and yeah, you guys like definitely hustles entrepreneurial, like have a side hustle, like
Yep.
literally work 65 to 80 hours a week, and it's like an ongoing joke, and it's like I'm like, yep, I totally get it.
Hey, and the funny thing is, I think the overlap here between cultures is, things like medical or engineering or like half the reason probably I
Yeah.
came engineering. Like I background, like I was graduated school with engineering degree. I was like,
Hmm.
if I can go back, would I do that again? I was like, probably I changed. Maybe I
Oh
do it. I
yeah.
don't know.
Huh.
Yeah. So
That's funny.
in terms of just your organization you're at there now, so you started an organization, leaving the sales background. Um, but I think what you've mentioned before we started recording today is that leading an organization is very natural to you from coming from sales, and then even with what you mentioned with starting ERG groups, community connecting
Hmm.
people, that's a huge part of leadership. How's
Hmm.
that transition been for you? As a
Hmm.
leader with the background that you've had.
Yeah, yeah, it's I mean, I definitely have some imposter syndrome around this, right? Like
Yeah,
it's even weird to call myself like a leader,
yeah,
but if you look back to like high school or college, or I was always leading like the ERG groups, right? In high school, like I
yeah,
led that, and then college, and so looking back at it, I was like, what did I naturally do in my free time, right? Not what I wanted other people that wanted me to do, but what did
yeah,
I actually want to do? And it was always, I think, I mean, I've been fortunate. Like I think I've led I mean, I can't even remember how many holiday parties I planned for like all these companies I worked at,
Yeah.
Experian and all I was always part of like the wellness committees, like the social chair, the social impact chair. Like I've probably volunteered, I don't know, a ridiculous amount, right? So I think now looking back at it, I'm like, oh, I was a leader, but
Yeah.
I didn't hold the title. Like I was in the corporate sense, I never had like a people management role. But
Yeah.
then to your point, like in order to get like, let's say like 100 employees to come to the holiday party, right? Like that, like you had to be a leader or else no one
Yep.
would show up, right? So
Absolutely.
it's like these skills are so transferable. If you're just good at like getting people excited, getting people to say yes, like you're a leader, you know.
Yep. Yep.
And I was always I'm an ENFP on the Myers-Briggs type assessor, so I was always
Yep.
campaigning for some initiative. Usually it's like a nonprofit. Like I volunteered for all these nonprofits, and that was like another like aha moment that I had as a leader because I'm like, wow, I'm really good at getting people to donate to to all these initiatives, all these charities, and I was like, huh. So back to your point, like you'll realize it because people will naturally come to you and ask you for your opinion, right? Or people would want you to join their cause or be on the board of your nonprofit or whatever. So after like 100 data points, I was like, all right, I guess I am a leader.
If you get 100 people to show up to an event, you're 1,000% a leader. You don't even have to even ask it at that point. And I love that you mentioned that you didn't have to have a title to be a leader, right?
Mm,
If people follow you, if people are asking for your input, if people are valuing what you do, your presence, what you do for them, like that's ultimately leadership in its purest form. And then there's
mm,
people with titles that that do that. There's people without titles that do that.
mm,
But the title doesn't make you a leader. I love as well. You talked about the humanity of leadership and the humanity of sales. A couple of questions ago, you talked about just how you got people excited about your chiropractor, right? Uh,
yeah, yeah.
and that's huge, dude. Like that is sales. And that's why I always tell people sales is humor. Like if you can introduce someone in a way that people get excited about something, it
Mm,
doesn't mean it's to be faux or fake or anything like that goes to the bro culture and
mhm.
macho culture. But you genuinely
Yeah,
appreciate your chiropractor and introduce her in a
yeah,
way that everyone sees your enthusiasm and
mm,
buys in. You can't fake that. You can't.
yeah, yeah. She's amazing. I mean, that's like the beauty of life, right? Like, what other professions like are you meeting so many people every day,
Yeah.
you know? And and like sometimes like I wake up and I'm like, man, I'm so lucky. Like I got paid to like have lunch with this like amazing human being and get to know and then they were open enough to share about some of their problems and
Yeah.
we were able to and I was able to refer them to centers of influences and they can partner together. And it's just like, man, like, like when we're present to it, like it's a very beautiful profession. Of
Yeah.
course, like it has its ups and downs, but sometimes like I'll go to these conferences and then like my wife is like, when do you work? She's like, you just go out and you take people out to lunch and like, she's like, and you're on podcasts all day. It's like, when are you actually working? It's like so funny.
It's oh god, it's such a funny comment because to your point, it's a different experience when you're doing it like for the right reasons versus when you're doing it
Mm,
for the output, right? Like
mm,
you just said you get gratification and fulfillment from the day to day. I got to take someone out to lunch. I got to connect with people. I got to solve this person's problems, and that filled your cup up. That's different than people who are maybe in the profession who are like, oh my God, I had to do X amount of meetings so I can get X amount of conversions, so I get X
mm,
amount of ACV. Like those are two completely different experiences of the exact same thing.
mm.
And to the point about why is that's where that centers in, right?
Yeah, and you can argue that actually sometimes the metric driven person sometimes is more successful, right? Because
Yeah,
maybe they focus more on paper. It might seem like they're more successful, but as
yeah,
we all know, we both have been in sales for a while. There's a difference between like someone who's like maybe like they hit 189% of their number, which is still amazing,
yeah,
but they're like generally happy and they have balance and like they actually enjoy versus the one who like gets 350% but is burnt out, gained 50 pounds, and you can tell like they're like miserable or like
yeah,
they're just like I'm not saying everyone is like that who's like, but we all know like, a
Yeah.
handful of salespeople that you're like, yo, like you should probably take a break, like you look like you're about to have a stroke any second now. And that's
Literally.
from genuine love. Like I'm, as a
Yep.
person who just loves, like wants them to be sustainably like, you know, so that they're not like just escaping via like drinking too much or, you
Yeah.
know, like going crazy, like gambling all of their um, commissions in Vegas, right? It's like
Yeah.
there's like self-destructive like salespeople, and then there's salespeople who you're just like, okay, like you have a family, like you have integrity, like you have like good values. So I just want to make that distinction because like I have seen some salespeople that make a lot of money, but
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like, man, like you do not look happy right now, and I try not to be judgmental, but it's just like genuine concern for some of those. Some of them are my friends.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so important, man. I know we've talked around the subject for a bit, but we can talk about it now as well as like the mental health aspect of life in sales, right? I've been very transparent on this podcast with you. I've been going to therapy for 6 or 7 years now. And, one of the reasons I went was, I got into a BDR job, right? I was like, those, so many things I can't control here. I was in a closing
Mm,
role before. So
yeah.
working on that and other life stuff. And, you know, what I keep anchoring on for this podcast, what I've told people that I've mentored is like you have to find a way to have sustainability in sales, and the sustainability is kind of what you've mentioned, right? Is you have to find the way to find a why in the day to day, right? And some people can find that why and reach that fulfillment. Sometimes sales just isn't the right place for someone, but they're not
Mm,
getting out of it because they're not making money or not. They're doing getting out of it because they understand, hey, I maybe want to solve problems in a different way than sales does. But sustainability in sales is that needs its own book. There's been two books I've decided I want to have on from this podcast. One was with one of my previous
mm.
mentors. That's like, hey, what's the psychology of sales? Not towards the customer, but towards ourselves, right? Like, how do you
Oh,
process things that are brought up
that's a dude. That's a good one. You're right. There's not as much of an emphasis on that. There's a lot more books on the
outward?
customer. Yeah.
Yep, yep.
I mean,
What's the inward part?
that could be. Man, I might have to steal that from you.
Hey, dude, if you want to co-write the book, we have it right here on the podcast. We're
Oh
writing
my
together.
God, that'd be great.
It's that, and then maybe a chapter in there or a second book is around sustainability in sales. Because to your
Yeah,
point, I've seen
yeah,
so many people, and to your point, from a caring perspective, whether they're performing well or not, you're just looking at them like, dude, like the way you're experiencing this, you can't do for long. More than a year, more than a couple months there. So how can you get
yeah,
to a point to where you can do this in a healthy, sustainable way? So
yeah. I mean, and I've been guilty of it myself, right? So I'm just
yeah,
speaking from
same.
experience, where
Yeah,
especially as an SDR, you're just like, because you just want to get promoted so quickly,
yep,
and there's a lot of uncontrollable factors, right? Whether it's
yep,
macro or yeah, there's just a lot of things that are out of your hands, and yeah, I definitely have burnt out, and just being a person of color as well, right? It's like
yep.
and maybe I'm putting this unfair pressure on myself. But it's like as an Asian person, it's like I look around, I'm like, they might not ever hire another Asian salesperson if I suck at this, and that in itself adds a lot of pressure for me to like work
Davidson, this is why I
10.
love you, dude. Because we can have the realest conversations. Because anyone of
Uh,
color can have that same thought process of like, oh my
yeah,
god, like if I mess this up, who's going to give another shot to someone who else
yeah,
looks like me?
yeah, exactly. And that's so much pressure that we put on ourselves. It's like, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, man. Um, we have to have another episode on culture. We do because there's so many things to unlock on that one, man. You've talked about just the impact you're making as a leader there, and within the events that you've created and thrown. Um, where does that social impact and influence come from, right? So your why around these things. You seem to be
mm,
very fulfilled from them. And again, similar to sales, there's metrics that are vanity for that. There's metrics that are impactful, but you really care about connecting people and providing impact. Where do you think that comes from?
mm. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I think some of it was just out of like survival, where I was like,
Yeah.
man, like, am I the only one that feels this way? So,
Yep.
being a person of Vietnamese descent, like out of the 150 sales teammates I've had in my entire career, right? Like, I don't think I can remember like only a handful of Asian colleagues and AEs or BDRs. And I was just like, why do I like, is it just me? Like, why do I feel so out of place, right, in some of these sales orgs? And so some of it was just out of like, let me just create and reach out to other people, and we'll meet and we'll kind of be able to have small group and be able to just discuss like our insecurities around these topics. So some of it was just like, um, but then I started posting online, through Reddit, and then some of the posts like got a lot of engagement, and I was like, oh wow, this is resonating with a lot of people. And some of it was like just genuinely just out of like, if not me, then who else will do it, you know? So I think I felt like a huge responsibility, because I also noticed like, I hate to generalize like this, but I won't say which organizations, but I've interviewed a lot of Asian executives, and well, some of it's like the PR and legal side is like, no, like you guys can't talk about this topic, like that's
Yep.
off limits. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to go on my own, because I was like, all right, like if you guys can't do it, then I'll just do it myself, because I don't
Right.
have to answer to anybody, you know.
Yep.
So, and then some of it was just like hosting a lot of these panel events with a lot of like our Asian executives. I was like, oh, there's a lot of common themes here, but no one's really talking about it. And then,
Yeah.
yeah, so a lot of it's just like genuine curiosity, and some of it's just like, I don't see anyone else doing it, and so why not be a trailblazer, right? Why not be someone at the forefront of this?
And that is leadership. There's a few better ways to say that than, hey, I observed something and it was something I experienced, and I wanted to be the first one to not just validate that it was only me, but provide a safe place for others to talk about
Mm,
the experience too.
yeah.
You talked about imposter syndrome for that as well. Um, how does that play into just everything you've experienced in your journey, right? Across sales to being a leader to organizing some of
Mm,
these events there, we all kind of feel like, hey, like, am I
mm,
in the right place? Or, can I actually do this thing? How do you kind of process an imposter syndrome aspect of things?
mm. This is a tough one for me, because like I do think there's a special breed of people, like sounds like you're also very empathetic, like like me just being very sensitive, like
Yeah.
I just like I pick up everyone's emotions and their energy and all that, right? So
Yeah.
I think I started from growing up and just being very like aware of like the
Yeah.
emotions of what's going on. So
Yeah.
I think or even at an early age, like I was like, huh, like why am I so like emotional? And then
Yeah.
I would take in like a lot of other people's energies. Um, but in imposter syndrome, I think we to normalize it, like I think we all experience some
Yeah.
version of it, whether we sometimes it manifests itself in like more, I would say negative ways, where it's like signaling, or like it's like, oh, look at me, like all these awards, and don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, like I post, like when I get an award, I post it too, right?
As
But
you should.
yeah, right. But there's a difference between me posting it because I'm genuinely like proud of it, and it's like, hey, like the 10,000 hour rule. Like I'm just like present. I have gratitude towards like all the mentors, all the people, and like this is just me, just like acknowledging all the people that made it happen. Versus like I'm just doing it, and then because I'm like, oh, like I really like the likes, and every like I get, that means I'm like worthy. Like I'm worthy of like being up there, you know?
Yeah.
So I think so for me, imposter syndrome, it's been a lifelong struggle, to be
Yeah.
honest. And I think it's just because if I'm comparing myself to like the top people always, like, we both have a lot of worked at a lot of organizations with very, very successful, very ambitious people. I
Mm-hmm.
think if we're always comparing ourselves to others, like, we don't really know. We only know their highlight reels, right? We don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. Um, Ian's pretty open about this. I'm sure he'll be okay with
Yeah.
me sharing this. But
Yeah.
as I was launching my Daring Hearts, and a lot of the topics were around like external motivation versus intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, right? And he's like, dude, like this applies to me, and I'm like
Yeah.
killing it on paper, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key. If we're always comparing ourselves, and like we're always going to have imposter syndrome, you know. So
Yeah.
it is a lifelong journey. I'm curious, like how, like what resources you've taken to aid you in some of these things, especially now because you're also
Yeah.
a leader, right? A relatively newer people manager, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a lot of it for me. I know we talked about therapy, right? That's kind of similar to your percentages, right? Whether it be mentorship, coaching, which you got to talk about coaching too. That's so important, investing in yourself. But coaching, therapy, just generally wanting to get better, right? And that's a lot of what the podcast creates a community of, is people that are looking to get better and do that in a very human way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I should probably make another episode for us to kind of tell my story of this, but ultimately the high level of that is like,
Mm-hmm.
I've done engineering, I've done sales, I've done success. And I always talk about Daniel Pink's To Sell is Human, right? Which humanizes what sales is. But after getting all these accolades, right, what I realized was that the things that made anyone most successful, no matter what my title was or side of the organization I was on, were the things that made people most human, right? And that was kind of a realization, no matter how technical, how sales, how value, no matter what it was, it's like the people I
Mm-hmm.
see that continuously are successful and doing that, and as we talked about, in a healthy, sustainable way, are the people who lean into those human aspects. So to your point, right, where that be in those positions I've had in the past or even in this role, like it just comes back to anchoring on some of the values that you've mentioned and the values that we talk about in every episode of this podcast. Is like, what are the human things that provide you fulfillment that you can teach others to get better at, that is going
Mm-hmm.
to be amazing for whatever role they're in now, but also by you talking about how, for you, right, how connecting with those relationships, how making sure you're intentional, right, making sure you're able to really connect with people. Like that's something that you get excited about and provides
Mm-hmm.
community just by you talking about it as well. So for me, it really has been a combination of that therapy, mentorships, coaching, but also being a part of communities that are based
Mm-hmm.
around learning from each other and doing that in a healthy way.
Man, that's awesome. But yeah, that's beautiful, beautifully said. And in some way, in a lot of ways, I'm sure that's why we created this, right? Because you can
Yep.
create more of these spaces, and people that might be earlier on in their career can have virtual mentors, and if there's resonance, they can also reach out and, you know, develop a relationship with some of your guests as well. So this is it's beautiful what you're creating.
That's a part of the long-term plan, is be to have this more interactive. I would hate for this to only be just a podcast, or right, whether it be, meetups or, some types of trainings, whatever that be, right? But yeah, it's part of the long-term plan. You mentioned something interesting as well there that I've asked a couple guests this, but I'll kind of just throw this out of left field for you.
Uh-huh.
Social media is so interesting, and both you and I are on there, right, in our own platforms, and everyone's on there in their own individual
Hmm.
personal platforms. But you talked about like posting accolades on social and being aware of that. You can post something, but your why is important for that.
Hmm.
Um, I almost wish there was a why button on any social media, like, hey, why did you post this? What are you searching
Uh,
for? Why you open this? Things like
huh.
that. And I think a lot of the why for people is they look to feel listened to at some point. So
Hmm.
you and I both go to therapy. I think our therapists hopefully listen to us. But what areas do you provide or in your life where Davidson feels listened to, right? And how
Hmm.
unique is that based off of what a lot of the experience is today?
Hmm. Yeah. So I created a men's group, and
Yeah,
that has been really great because
yeah,
we were able to like process a lot of difficult, you know, whether it was like potential divorces to parents passing away, unfortunately,
yeah,
and grief and a lot of these emotions. And like, man, that has been some of the most rewarding spaces to be a part of. And, you know,
yeah,
and just like, it was cool because I was able to create that from scratch. So it was just like
yeah,
a very beautiful thing to be a part of. Um, yeah, I've tried like every type of therapy. So a lot of these like
Yeah.
meditation communities also has
Yeah.
been, I think they're both very similar, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of these meditation places, whether it's like intentional yoga or breath work, also has been really healing and just being able to like be with emotions.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think Landmark has been like huge. That's a really big community for people who don't know. It's pretty intense. The way I
Yeah.
describe it, it's like 500 hours of therapy, grant like crammed into like an intense 15-hour a day back to back to back, so 3 days in a row program. And then if you
Yeah.
continue, there's like even more that you can go to. But it's very intense, but it's great because it's like a lot of healing work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, those communities are amazing, right? And I think what's interesting about what you said is that each one of those times you've been surrounded by people who were open to connecting and sharing, and then a lot of these things have frankly been in person. Right.
yeah.
Social media is great, and this is from, I mean, we both have podcasts, right? You have to get out and meet people at some point,
Mm,
and
yeah.
there's magic in that. There always will be
Mm,
magic in that. um
yeah.
in terms of just investing in yourself, kind of starting to end where we began, right? We both met in Ian's program. You just talked about some great ways to create community, provide a safe place for yourself and others on listening, but also that's investing in yourself, right? So whether you want to look at it from the corporate sense or you want to look at it from the human sense or whatever you want to do, like that's
Mm,
providing investment for yourself. Um, how do you really think about that, and how do you encourage people to start doing that? Because to your point, ever
yeah.
since I've gone to some of these programs, or I've been a part of Ian's program, like you experience that growth that you don't kind of stop. You're like, dude, I wish I'd only done this earlier.
Mm. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, the paradox of choice is real, right? There are
Yeah,
so many programs. I mean, I've been obsessed. Like, my wife would say, like, buy a little too much, investment in these things. But yeah, so I would say like try everything, right? You just don't
yeah,
know. So I've joined Jamal's program, Brandon Fuhari's program, Ian's program, and then
yeah,
and that's one of the reasons why I started my own, because I felt like a lot of these programs, like, it's all about sales, right? Which is ultimately like, oh, how to make more money. But I was like,
yeah,
what? I was like, there's no programs out there that teaches people to figure out like what are like the core values that like each
yeah,
human being, like, what is my legacy? What is my what are my like unique, how do I figure out my uniqueness, my unfair advantage, like what makes me tick, right? And that's why I decided to start my own mastermind, because I was like, I don't see anything out there that's doing this.
yeah,
So it's been a 8-year journey to figure it out, but I was able to like amalgamate like little bits and pieces of what I liked about each of these programs. But I think mine's going to be more like at the core, like more to
yeah,
the root. And because I do think like, yes, you can make all the money you want, right? But you could be making $1 million and be unhappy, and I hate to say this, but some of these sales programs are more focused on the million, like let's get to million.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I would say Ian's different, where he does, like, once you do meet with him week or month after month, like he does get to it, but it's still packaged in like sales, right? So it is still
yeah,
different. So but yeah, try everything is what I would
yeah,
say, and you'll find like communities naturally that like Edwin, who I shared with earlier, he joined Momentum, right? So that's like a
yeah,
self-development community focused like mostly on like Black leaders, right? So like
yeah.
that's like really cool that there is that community. So you'll find your tribe. You just have to like be open to saying yes. And if you feel very scared, like very uncomfortable, like that's a sign that you probably should do it. That's how we grow the most.
No, dude, it's all about the growth you mentioned there, and then finding your why in that growth. Um, because sustainable growth is why for the right reasons, but sometimes you don't know that reason until you actually start going. So even if you're not sure,
Mhm.
just kind of start moving.
Yeah.
To wrap things up, we always ask our three C's, right? So we talked about our values. C3 stands for the values that I've held throughout my career, which are clarity, connection, and co-creation. So those three C's here, just kind of wrapping things up, is one for clarity. you've talked a lot about whys and doing things for the right reasons, right, for today. How do you help people find that? Because to your point, people do things for
Mm,
different reasons, and sometimes people do
mm,
things they don't know why they're even doing it themselves. But
mm,
how have you helped, whether that be clients, customers, whoever that is,
mm.
be clear on their why?
Yeah, so there's like a three-step process that I usually take my clients through. One is like,
Yeah.
and this is a scary one, but like you literally write out your eulogy, like what, like
Okay.
who it is, who's saying it, what are they saying, what are the emotions, what are the like the, and like feel it, right? Like what's the energy, like what was your life about? Was it I was like the best father ever, and you know, I got to be at my kids' soccer games, and like, I was able to let them experience to travel the world, and like I was able to volunteer with them, right? So writing the eulogy is the first one. The second one is, um, and this is like a more confronting exercise, but it's like, because I think we all try to overcompensate for what we perceive we didn't have growing up. So
Yeah.
I think the framework that I use is there's usually a moment from your childhood, a moment from your teenager, and a moment from adulthood that have created what I call like the survival mechanism,
Yeah.
which is basically like, if let's say in my case, like I failed third grade. I was like very insecure about my masculinity as like an Asian male, like in high school.
Yeah.
So like let me overcompensate by doing like crazy like Spartan races, like 15-hour
Yeah.
ultra marathons and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And then like one from adulthood. But once you kind of have that self awareness, you're like, oh, I don't need to overcompensate anymore. Like I can just like try to. So just doing that has helped. And then the last thing I do, the framework is like, you just, this is like a weird thing, because I do think we're all not a good judge of who we really are for people, because we're always our own worst critic. So I would go up to like 30 different people and ask them like, what are my weaknesses and what are my strengths? And
Yeah.
then you'll find out, like, because a lot of things like we do that we take for granted, other people see it. They're like, you're really good at this, but because like we just so good at it, and then that will help you figure out, because sometimes like it's like stuff that you don't even think you're good at, because you're just like,
Yeah.
oh, like this is just me existing in the world, like just my being. But other
Yeah.
people will be like, Davidson, like you're really good at like positive energy. Like people tend to be like get like a boost of energy when they're with you. But I'm like, oh, that's like valuable. They're like, yeah, that's very valuable. And I'm like, oh, cool. So that helped me like kind of realize like, oh, okay, like that's good to know, right? So those three exercises is how I'm able to help my clients like discover their why.
I love those, man, and they're so simple yet so difficult to master from the perspective of like we understand what we're gonna do it, but it's like, dude, writing down like, hey, what has been like things that help you be in survival mechanism from like you said, childhood to early adulthood to career. Like those are difficult things, but so important to be self aware of, man.
Mm, yeah.
In terms of connection, you talked a lot about connection in community in terms of um, even connecting to the present moment to the past that you talk about, like those childhood or early adult moments. Once you have a clear understanding of someone's why, how do you help them understand how they get to where they want to go, right? Connecting their
Mm,
now to their future self.
that's really good. Yeah, it's funny because it usually takes layers, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, the most simple exercise is like you just keep asking like why. So, like, let's
Yeah.
say like it's like, okay, I want to make President's Club. It's like, okay, well, why? Oh, because like it'd be cool to like network with really really ambitious people in Tulum or Bali, right? It's like, okay, well, why? It's like,
Yeah.
well, because it'll finally be like I'll prove to myself, and then like my mom will like, and my dad like really busting their ass to get me into like NYU will be worth it. It's like, okay, well, why? It's like, well, then I'll make my grandmother happy. It's like, well, why? And then after you do it like 100 times, right, you'll find like, well, so it's like, what if you had all of that? Like, what would that be like? So in my case, I did this exercise and I got like peace, like,
Yeah.
and I was like, that's interesting. So why am I working 80 hours a week to achieve peace? Why can't I just find peace in like the present moment?
Yeah.
So yeah, so to connect to that, I think you just have to keep asking why, and it'll take a lot of people like a lot of like because there's so many layers. But if you just once you get to like nothing, once you get to like the core, it'll hit you like a ton of bricks. Like you'll be like, oh my god, you'll get what we call like the goosies.
It'll become so clear, right?
Yeah, yeah, you'll resonate. You'll be like, oh my god, like this is my life's purpose.
Yeah. And co-creation, right? Getting to that spot where you understand your why, you understand how to get from where you're at today to where you want to go there. To what we just talked about, I think a lot of that is you understanding yourself and understanding that and asking those whys. But a lot of things, you know, whether that be through community, whether that be through sales, you require collaboration, you require working with others, right? You require some type of co-creation.
Hmm.
How do you best kind of navigate that when you realize you have a joint interest, a joint destination, a joint success metric, whatever you want to call it
Hmm.
there, and you're creating that path to get there together, and you have to realize that on that path there's going to be ups and downs, bumps along the way there. Somebody may say, hey, I think we're going to point A today, but next month they're like,
Hmm.
but point C looks a little bit better. So how do you kind of manage that co-creation, or some maybe people say
Hmm.
relationship process?
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of being human, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and every person has their unique nuances, and that's interesting, and just discovering those little what makes someone tick as well, right? But I do think generally like life is a lot richer when we
Yep.
are in creation with other people, right?
Yep.
Because we can be very, very successful and have all this money, but if we don't have other people around us to co-create with, then in my opinion, like there's less meaning in life, right? So
Yeah.
and so how I think about it is just like curiosity, like genuine, authentic curiosity. It's like, hey, like
Yeah.
what does make this person tick, you know? And sometimes people in the beginning they'll just say like the surface level stuff, right? But
Yeah.
the more open you are and the more curious you are, just and you just see like the intentions and the goodness of everyone, like you'll be able to like really understand who they are. And I think the framework that I usually use is like repeat what they say back to you and the emotions that they're giving, and then but more
Yep.
importantly, what is the commitment that they have. And
Yep.
behind every communication, even if it's like what you perceive as like a negative communication, there's a commitment behind that, right? So
Yeah.
even if it's like my mom nagging me, it's like, David, like, and she calls me, she's like, oh my God, there's like a shooting in New York City. And I'm like, it's like in the Bronx, mom's like, I'm in Manhattan, you know? And then it's like, but really her commitment is like, she just loves me. Like she just wants to
Yeah.
protect me, and she's doing everything in her power to like make sure I'm safe, you know? But like, so I think just having that self awareness is key, because, or else we just think everyone else is in opposition against us. But even if it's like you see it as negative feedback, it's like, well, they're just trying to give you like an opposing data point, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes like it is good to kind of take it with a grain of salt, but even perceived miscommunication is them trying to protect you, or them just trying to make sure like that you're not going to fail, you know.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying like there's everyone's like being curious, and everyone having making sure that you know like everyone inherently does have good intentions, right? It's just
Yeah.
like how we're able to react to it.
I love that, man, because so much of what we talk about with communication is reading back and hearing correctly what someone said, right? That's so important. That's things I've learned in therapy and just different parts of life as well there. And then two, listening for what isn't said but is conveyed. And that is
Hmm.
that's an art. That truly is an art.
Hmm.
Well, we're
Beautiful.
wrapping up. I know we're right at time here. First and foremost, though, Davidson, thank you, man. Really, really enjoy the conversation and connection today. I think there's more things we want to talk about based on what we mentioned, but there's so many things that we've connected on that I just genuinely appreciate you for, man. We always ask, you know, you shared so much of your journey, your gifts. I always say dropping gems with us in our community. What can we do to give back to Davidson?
Oh, yeah. Liking and subscribing is always great. I love connecting with people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am looking if any of this resonated with you, like I am creating that, or I'm launching a mastermind. Like, thank you, Ian, for
Yeah.
helping me create a lot of the frameworks in regards to it. But
Yeah.
to help people be able to find their why, their purpose, and find out like what is their uniqueness, what is their unfair advantage. So if any of that resonates with you, reach out. I'll be more than happy to support you in that journey and help
Yeah.
you be super intentional about crafting your legacy and your life's purpose.
Awesome. And where's the best way for them to reach out to you? I know Davidson Hang on LinkedIn. You have a YouTube.
Yeah.
Are those the best channels, or where would you prefer the outreach at?
Yeah, to Brian's point, I'm all over social media. So if you just search Davidson Hang, if you prefer Facebook, also super active on that. If you prefer Instagram, TikTok, I'm also active on that. So just whatever you ever, I think it's funny because I'm noticing like certain generations like have their
Yep.
preferred like
Yep.
platforms. I'm obviously big on LinkedIn because I used to work there, but yeah, I'm everywhere.
Well, hopefully we have some more people signing up for the mastermind there. Again, thank you so much, Davison. I can't say how much I appreciate you with today's conversation. And hopefully we'll be doing it again here soon, because there's some things that I was like, oh, dude, we can talk about this for days. But thank you, Davison. I really appreciate you, man.
Yeah, yeah, fine. So, yeah, I just wanted to say, like, thank you for creating this space. Like, it's clear that you're masterful at creating these, like, just having people be able to be so vulnerable and so open. Like, I know that's not an easy skill. Like, I'm sure you've practiced it a lot, and it's very admirable, like how you're able to hold space and the grace that you have, and yeah, the absolutely no judgment at all. So it was a wonderful experience. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, man. It's been things learned from, as you mentioned, mentors, coaches, Ian being one of them, yourself, frankly, therapists. It's this weird thing that I can't take credit for. Oftentimes, to the ego point of, I don't think it's Myron doing all these things. I've just been blessed to be experienced some things, and because I've experienced some things, it's to some degree my responsibility to share it with others there. So that's a long way of saying thank you, Davis. Well, again, I appreciate your conversation, man. I appreciate the gems. And we'll be talking again here soon.
Thank you.
Wait, friend, before you move on, take the time to gift yourself the sea of clarity or community. With so many pools for our time and attention today, one of the best gifts we can gift ourselves is a moment to simply breathe and be present, to gently process our experiences, emotions, and thoughts with grace and non judgment. To do this, take the next 2 remaining minutes of today's episode to practice simply paying attention to yourself, or maybe gift yourself and or others community by connecting with us online. You can thank today's guest, share your experience and lessons, or connect with others as well. To do this, go to the website c3.community or our C3 Community LinkedIn page, or of course, our YouTube channel. As always, friend, thank you for listening in and for choosing to be a part of our community. We hope you take a few precious moments for yourself. See you soon.